The Resident Evil games have certainly been more action-based on occasion, but today is not that occasion. Here are the 10 scariest Resident Evil games ranked. Number 10, Resident Evil. This list would simply not be complete without acknowledging the brilliant and groundbreaking first Resident Evil game. Launching all the way back in 1996, players were surprised to find ammunition in short supply in this Capcom game, despite oodles of undead zombies, not to mention experiments gone very, very wrong roaming the Spencer Mansion. Resident Evil expertly delivers upon jump scares, but it's the journals littered around each corner that ground the horror on an unnerving human level, describing their optimism during the early days of testing before jotting down disheveled single-digit word entries. Itchy tasty indeed. Number 9, Resident Evil Code Veronica. By all assumptions, the Resident Evil series was a PlayStation franchise first and foremost, only later porting its games to other consoles, months or years later. But Code Veronica bucked that trend by leaping into the flashy new Sega Dreamcast, and this game too feels off the beaten zombie path with new first-person shooting and fully rendered 3D backgrounds. The story sheds light on the family behind the Umbrella Corporation, whose disturbing personalities fit their macabre creations to a T. The real shame is that Code Veronica's wild difficulty spikes often dismayed players from finishing this spooky story, so here's hoping for a remake. Number 8, Resident Evil Zero. Resident Evil Zero, as the name implies, is the prequel to the first Resident Evil game. How much could have occurred before Rebecca met up with Chris? Well, there's at least 2 sizable chapters worth. The first takes place aboard a runaway train packed with undead zombies. The second is yet another Umbrella laboratory and many more creepy monsters, but most are of animal origins. This naturalistic approach to Resident Evil was a welcomed or unwelcome change of pace because the slimy creatures were new to the series and haven't seen a return since, making Resident Evil Zero still unique and darn creepy all these years later. Number 7, Resident Evil Revelations. What is it about Resident Evil, portable consoles, and boats? Well, following her friend Barry's footsteps, Jill Valentine boards several cruise ships as she attempts to escape from this nautical-themed horror. At the time Resident Evil Revelations was first released, this had some longtime fans excited. You see, Resident Evil 5 and 6 won't be making appearances on this list because they're simply just not scary. Kind of the point, right? But Resident Evil, constrained by the comparatively modest hardware of the 3DS, meant returning to the psychological horror roots of the franchise. It's more creepy than truly disturbing, but that was a lifeline to the series. Or would it be called a deathline? Number 6, Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 has been ported to a comical number of platforms. Little RE4 on the Zebo, anybody? What's often overlooked is what a tremendous get this was for the Nintendo GameCube when it launched all the way back in 2005. At the time, fans were blown away by this new, more action-driven Resident Evil with its revolutionary target system. I know that sounds a bit hypocritical, but the action never overlooked the horror. Resident Evil 4 was a perfect merger of distressing images and desperate struggles against gross creatures, and its final chapter certainly returned to the traditional horror of the franchise. Resident Evil 5 and 6 got way out of hand, but RE4, that was the sweet spot. Number 5, Resident Evil 2002. There are many Resident Evil remakes today, which sounds a little strange to say how suddenly they've all ganged up after a long break. The first Resident Evil remake was in 2002, and the Resident Evil 2 remake was in 2019. What was going on in those 17 years? Well, maybe Capcom thought better than trying to top their previous efforts, as the Resident Evil remake in 2002 instantly shot to a must-own game on the Nintendo GameCube, with its top-tier visual presentation. There is one caveat, that being unless you've played the first Resident Evil, you may not appreciate the changes here, but still, it'll scare you plenty. Number 4, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. I bet you thought we were going to put the remake on this list. Well, no. And that's no knock against the Resident Evil 3 remake, but it's about time Resident Evil 3 Nemesis got its flowers. Often overlooked as a simple expansion to Resident Evil 2, simply because it reused some pre-rendered backgrounds, the ingenious addition to the formula was Nemesis, an unkillable, lumbering enemy on a mission to eliminate Jill Valentine. And the scariest part? He could open doors! That's going way too far, Mr. Nemesis. I know you've got a job to do, but that's breaking the rules as far as I'm concerned. Number 3, Resident Evil 4 Remake. Look, we're not going to dispute that the Resident Evil 4 Remake is more action game than survival horror in its mechanics. That is not in question. But this list is about being scary, and the RE4 Remake is constantly putting players in scenarios, action-driven or not, that are really, really creepy. The crowds are smarter, and there's far more fake-outs, especially in the enemies' animations. And all that extra action-style control doesn't make the creatures you're combating any less unnerving. If anything, your ability to whip back seemingly normal citizens is disturbing on a different level entirely. Number 2, Resident Evil Village. I bet you weren't expecting to see the newest game so high up on the list, but if you didn't get the memo, Resident Evil is scary again, and Resident Evil Village wastes little time absolutely devastating the player with a deeply unsettling introductory cutscene which shows protagonist Ethan witnessing a living nightmare. From there, he's plopped into the titular village, complete with gigantic ladies and spooky witches. Again, this is pretty much an action game, and a great one at that, but the overall aesthetic and story are so disturbing, the misery never lessens, nor does the danger. Number 1, Resident Evil 7, Biohazard. Yes, really. When stacked together, it's hard to imagine any other Resident Evil game delivering all the unhinged violence and depressing narrative beats as the 7th main entry in the Resident Evil series, going by its Japanese title, Biohazard. This game introduced the first-person perspective to the franchise, and man, did Capcom take advantage of that, putting all the grotesque gore right up in your face. This also allowed players to make eye contact with the Baker family, who, the more you learn about, are simply victims in a situation they have no control over, but you're still gonna need to take them out to survive, and you never feel that good about it. And that's exactly the point of Resident Evil. You overcome the odds, and you still feel a bit icky. And that's why this one is the scariest Resident Evil of them all. And there you have it, the 10 scariest Resident Evil games ranked. Pretty creepy, huh? Well, in horror movies, they say you should never split up, so let's keep clicking around here on Game Rant. We've got plenty more videos to share, so hopefully we'll see you soon. Wait, don't open that door!